Geographers, welcome to the first of what I expect to be many videos that are simply me going through your textbook, going through the different chapters for the specific region that we are covering at that moment, and I'm just going to go through, read through, point out some key things that I want you to know, that I want you to pay attention to. But also, we'll be pointing out a lot of things that make me cranky. You'll see as we start out here. So, all right, let's look at the text. We're starting with chapter 4, which might not make sense chronologically. Why not start with, we did discuss chapter 1 or the intro or whatever it was, but why not just go in order, right? I want to start with North America, and I want to do this because I am a North American, specifically a citizen of the United States, a product of our public school system, higher education, and all of that, and as such, I have a very specific view, kind of a preconceived concept of the world and of these different regions. It's not perfect. Clearly, it's specific to my being an American. And honestly, I think the vast majority of the students I have in this class are coming from more or less that same position, right? We might have different backgrounds, different racial, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic, that broad category. We might be different in that regard. But I think as Americans, even that, just saying Americans to mean the United States of America, whereas people in South America get mad that we're American too, or whatever. We'll probably cover that when we get to that or later on in here, but hopefully this makes sense. I like to start with North America, no matter where it is in a textbook, because I think it's important to come to terms with who we are, then go on and look at the rest of the world and connect a lot of this stuff. So we're starting with North America. Okay, and to the book and the chapter. With this chapter and the other chapters, we have these learning objectives. You should read through them. I'm not going to dwell on them, but it's a nice way to point out the goals of the chapter, what the author is hoping you'll get out of the chapter itself. And so, like for this first video, what I'm going to get into is describe at least some of these key geographic features of North America. And my plan is I am not going to sit here for an hour or two and read through the entire chapter and have a little commentary or whatever. I'm just going to break it up into chunks. Read the first, like this 4.1, North America's physical setting. I don't even think I'm going to read that whole first section right there, right? But I'm going to go over some material, talk about it, stop the video, go through and process it and get it to Canvas or wherever I'm getting it to you through. And then I'll, stop that one and come back and make another video and hopefully have little 5, 10, 15, 20-minute videos about certain topics. It'll help you sort through things. It'll help my own processing and dealing with audio captions and that kind of stuff. That's the goal. All right? So let's get into this. Let me get into what my plan is, what my goal is with this stuff. In fact, let me close that. All right. So this first one, 4.1, North America's physical setting. Oh, check this out. The giant redwoods that stretch over California's Redwood National Park are the tallest trees on Earth, towering to over 100 meters. These trees are also exceptionally old. One such tree, known as General Sherman, is the largest tree in the world by volume and is believed to be over 2,000 years old. That's a cool tree right there. Maybe some of you have seen this tree or the redwoods themselves or any of that. Yeah, we got these in California. Pretty cool things. Now, at the time General Sherman first emerged from the ground, North America was settled by a number of indigenous groups. It would be 1,000 more years until Europeans would make contact with the Americas and blah, 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 right? So okay, okay, okay. Now I'm getting cranky right off the bat. And I'm not trying to attack the author of this book. She did a great job in putting stuff together. I haven't written one of these world regional textbooks, clearly, or we'd be using it. So I'm not here to pick on the author or be a jerk about that stuff. But instead, like, my issues with this first passage are not the writing or any of that stuff. It's a larger issue we have, and not even just in geography, but in academia in general, when it comes to separating North America from other parts of the world. Quite often, what we do is we invoke nature, right? North America is treated as this place that is more natural, more pristine. That's a term that is used quite a bit to kind of suggest that it's untouched in comparison to other locations. Now, a few issues with this. Number one, this whole pristine thing, the idea that it's been untouched, that's nonsense. Humans have been messing with this for almost as long as they've been messing with other places, just in different ways and capacities. One issue, like one reason why Europeans were so blown away by North America was how gorgeous it was, how much nature was still intact, because they were coming from Europe, which had been cutting down trees like crazy, building up, different structures and roads and things like that. Just the transformation of the landscape, radically different. But the assumption was this was untouched. Now, in reality, these different indigenous North Americans, whether we're talking about the first people living in California or on the East Coast or up in Canada or wherever, they were clearly messing around with nature, changing the landscape through a variety of ways, a lot of which we're not going to get into in here. But the point being that the natives who were here when the Europeans showed up weren't just sitting around, hanging out, not touching anything, living, not too differently from the wolves and grizzly bears and eagles and things like that. Like, that's the story that the white folks were telling. But the reality is they were changing it and shaping it. The difference being that these different indigenous groups, they weren't trying to chop down every single tree to make a profit. In fact, a big difference is that we didn't have capitalism running rampant in the same way that the Europeans would have it running rampant and all of that, right? So right off the bat, the idea that this was untouched, no. It also kind of gets to the sense of the way this is written, and I don't think this is necessarily the author's intention, but just the idea that we have this tree. It's 2,000 years old, and that's brought up a lot, and is an amazing thing. Just the thought of being 2,000 years old, and then you think of the human history that's gone on since this tree has been living and all of that. But it kind of makes it feel like, North America was settled by a number of indigenous groups. It makes it feel like these indigenous groups are just kind of here. Europeans show up, but it kind of strips the humans from nature itself. We know the indigenous people, again, whether it's California, East Coast, Canada, stretching down through Mexico, down to South America, we know they've been around for thousands and thousands of years. Anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 years. We've got different archaeological evidence, different things pointing to when human beings first show up, right? In North America as well as South America. And of course, if you talk to some of the indigenous groups, they'll say, what are you talking about? It wasn't 15,000 years or whatever. We've been here since day one, right? And they'll tell you the story of how their people came to be and, the religious connections and all of that stuff. What this whole 15,000 year idea is, it's all science. It's all, scientific evidence, archaeological evidence, but clearly different groups have different ways of seeing the world and understanding their place in the world, and that's something we'll definitely cover. But again, my point being, human beings have been in North America, let's just say North America alone, for a long, long time. But there's a real emphasis on the idea that North America is natural, or much more natural than Europe, than Asia, and so on. Okay, that's something that's actually, well, it's been pretty evil, to be perfectly blunt and honest. In fact, one great scholar, his name's Mark Spence, he wrote this book, Dispossessing the Wilderness. It's all about the quest for creating national parks, which the national park system in this country and in many other countries, it's seen as a wonderful thing. We're protecting these natural resources, not letting developers come in and destroy them to make a profit and all that. What Spence gets into is, by the way, in case it wasn't obvious, there were people living here already, right? In these spots, in Yosemite, in Yellowstone, in Death Valley, in these different national parks and monuments and all of that we have. And so we catalogs like what happened. And it's not pretty, Americans. We don't have a good track record with moving people out of the wilderness to save it, right? And you could even say, looking at some of these parks, are we really saving it, or are we just changing it and again profiting off of this stuff? But that whole point of trying to play up North America's, ancient, beautiful, nature, whether it's geological or biological or whatever, there were two things we were trying to do with this. Number one, we were trying to get Europeans to shut up. We were getting tired of them saying, hey, North America, hey, U.S., why is everything so new? Where are your cathedrals at? Where are your castles at? Where's your stuff that's, 1,000 years old or whatever? We didn't have anything like that because the Europeans who came over here started building stuff, but everything's more or less new. Like, we're amazed if something is 100 years old in this country. In Europe, that's nothing, right? So it was kind of a way to say, like, okay, we don't have old castles, but Grand Canyon, millions of years old, right? Or, Yosemite or whatever it might be. We were pointing out how ancient these different natural and national landscapes were. Trying to make us feel cooler about who we are. So there's that. Then the other issue was it allowed us, in kind of fetishizing all of this nature and ancient nature, it allowed us to easily grab these human beings who are already living there, the indigenous North Americans, remove them from these places to protect nature, even though clearly these indigenous groups have been protecting nature for thousands of years because it looked so beautiful, even though they'd been living there, living in harmony and all that kind of stuff, right? So this notion, what gets me about this, and what we tend to do when we talk about North America, is that we play up this myth that North America is ancient and natural and not, soiled by human presence. No, what it really is for millennia, it was the Europeans didn't come over and soil it. The people who were living here were doing a much better job taking care of it. And it's not just, I can hear it now, like, why you gotta pick on the white folks or whatever. It's just because the Europeans were here. There's plenty of evidence that, like, China, did plenty of deforestation and all these big empires around the world. And the idea of being an empire, growing, conquering, that kind of stuff, a lot of that took place all over. It wasn't just the Europeans, but they definitely are the ones who brought it here. Okay. So right off the bat, let's not fall into that trap. And we'll get into, I already introduced in Canvas or wherever it was, the idea of plate tectonics. Pangea, we'll talk about that. But also keep in mind, North America is no newer than Europe or Africa, nor is it older than Europe or Africa or Asia or any of these other places. It was all Pangea. It was all one connected thing if we go back 300, 250 million years ago, right? And then through continental drift, broke apart, got into new places. Kind of the irony here, though, too, is that California itself, that's actually relatively new, compared to the rest of North America. Our state, California, shows up within, millions of years as opposed to billions of years when we're dealing with this kind of stuff. It's all one, it's all connected. It's just our perspective in terms of what's natural, what's ancient, and so on. So we're going to talk about, I'm sure I'll be getting into natural resources, stuff like that, but we're not going to fall into this myth that this is where they exist and every other place is tainted by humanity, okay? So look at that. It took me, about 15 minutes to cover this first paragraph. We're doing great. All right, let me move on. Okay, I want to connect this idea. So they get into this whole natural stuff, but then let's talk about this notion of North America. Traditionally, the continent of North America extends from the Canadian Arctic through the United States and Mexico and goes down to Panama. And it gives us our C figure 4.1. So we can look down at that map to get a sense of the traditional idea of North America. What's the crack up is that it's cropped. So Mexico is gone, even though kind of explaining that's what's happening right here. But we have kind of the sense of what North America is, what we learn in terms of, like in elementary school or whatever. But what your author is getting to is the idea that really, when we're doing world regional geography, we're going to crop North America to like this image is right here. It's going to be Canada and it's going to be the United States. End of story, right? Sorry, Mexico, you're out of here. And the reason being, and your author gets into this, she's not the only person to come up with this. This is not her own idea. All of these textbooks that I've seen do this. This is something these classes do. But she writes, when considering the region, in quotes, of North America, however, that is, the area united by common physical and cultural characteristics, there are distinct similarities between Canada and the US in terms of language, a shared history, that are quite different from their Spanish-speaking neighbors to the south. Okay. Okay. I get it. Especially if you're a United States kind of guy who looks like me, who's a bit on the whiter, pastier side of things. Yeah, you can see that connection of, former British colonies and connections in that way, the Anglo nature of these two nations, the idea of English being the language spoken, right, in the U.S. We only speak English, and I'm guessing in Canada they only speak English, right? Except for, of course, half of them who speak French over here on the east. I'm like, okay, so that doesn't work. And then, of course, yeah, we speak English here. It's not even the official language of the United States. It's just kind of what, by default, we typically tend to speak in. But Californians, assuming you're taking this class because you're in California at this California, school and all of that. But really, everybody in the southern states within the United States, there's some Espanol going on, right? Either you're speaking it, with your family and friends, or people who speak it or whatever. It's kind of absurd. But this is another attitude we have, is that we assume that Canada and the US, much closer, much more similar, much more of a shared history and culture and all that than, say, the US and Mexico. No. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I've never been to Canada. I'll probably go at some point. I'm sure it's beautiful and there's cool stuff to see, and there's stuff I'd like to see. But honestly, I've never gone. I've been up, in northern Washington State. I've been up in northern Michigan. I've been, technically I've been further north than some Canadian citizens, if you look at the map and how that works. I've been kind of tempted to drive over the border, but it hasn't happened. And in part, it's because of some of these perceived similarities. It doesn't seem that exciting to cross the border and to go into Canada and go like, whoa, crazy. It's going to be kind of similar in some regards. So I get that sense. But at the same time, Mexico, California, Arizona, southern Texas, like there's similarities in there as well, right? I feel more connected, in fact, to Mexico and Latin America in general than I do to the Arctic, to Canada and the general north up there. Many of you probably have that same idea. So again, it's ridiculous what we do. And not a lot of people question these things, but we do it, right? It's the notion that the US and Canada, that's a region. Mexico, we're going to lump that in with South America and Central America, and we'll just call it Latin America, and we'll be good. And I'm going to do that. We'll just look at these two countries right here to keep things simple. But of course, we'll connect this notion and we'll trouble this notion when we get to Latin America in the class, right? But that's just silly. A lot of different connections. But this is how we're going to connect. And honestly, I'm talking about language and eating, burritos versus, say, poutine, or some Canadian dish or something. There's, there are those connections there. But the author also gets into, it's not just cultural stuff. It's not just families and what you're speaking and things like that. I mean, there's these, physiographic regions of North America, the actual nature that we're dealing with. And she gets into, Appalachian, the Rocky Mountains, talks about the climate and this stuff, and then kind of gets into like boreal forests, gorgeous pine forest, steep mountains, especially on the western side here, and beautiful pine trees, dense forests. We have these in Northern Europe as well, but for whatever reason, we're kind of ignoring that, even though we're talking about it, but lumping it here, and it is. In fact, I got, just to do it justice, I got some, let me pull this up. Yeah, let's look at some beautiful North American forest. Can you see that? I mean, we just have the snow-capped peaks in the background, and in the foreground, more mountains and hilly terrain, beautiful pine trees that we're looking at. You know what? This is Mexico. I'm sorry. This is a photo of a forest in Mexico. That's not cool, Mexico. You're not part of our club. You don't get to look like this. Hold on. Okay, wait. I've got another. There we go. Okay. Beautiful forest, the granite outcrops, the waterfall kind of spilling over in the foreground. I mean, you can picture, it's not there, but you can picture a bald eagle flying over, like holding an American flag. I mean, this is the U.S., or maybe even, an eagle holding the Canadian flag, or whatever. This is Mexico. My God, this one's also in Mexico. I'm sorry. Okay, so that's another Mexican forest. Tricky Mexico. Okay, but this one, I mean, this has kind of that temperate forest and a little more rainfall, slightly different vegetation, the river running through here, little gentle waterfalls, and like these, gorgeous. And also, it's Mexico. Look, here's what I did. I took like 2 minutes and I just Googled Mexican forest. And there's even a Wikipedia page that has all these pictures. That's where I stole these from. All these pictures of Mexican forest. And so many of them look just like what we think of as proper Anglo North American forest. But at the same time, the cool thing about Mexico is they also have in the southern end these rainforests, right? The tropical and lowland rainforests and cloud forests and things of that nature, subtropical areas and all of that. It's a tiny component of Mexico, but we see stuff like this, and this is just what we assume all of Mexico is going to be. This is what we do. My point being, let me get out of here. Stop it, Mexico. You can't trick us anymore. My point being, nothing is as it seems if all we're doing is going off of A, these kind of standardized intro to world regional textbooks, or B, we never actually venture out to learn and explore and see anything. And that doesn't mean you have to go to every single part of Mexico to see stuff. I certainly haven't done that. I haven't been to these beautiful, I've been to like cliche Mexico, the beaches and stuff we kind of think about. Haven't been to those beautiful forests. Gotta go, gotta check it out, gotta see it for ourselves, because it's fascinating. This is something that isn't really taught or explained or whatever. Some of you might be looking at this and go like, yeah, it's Mexico. It's near where I grew up or whatever, right? But the idea being nothing is as we tend to present it. All of these classic regions, they're garbage. Is that a nice intro video? All this stuff is garbage. Welcome to class, 14 more weeks or whatever we got in the semester. We're going to get through it. That's part of it. We're going to chip away at this stuff and get something a little more meaningful than just, the U.S. and Canada.